Welcome back to the Portishead Chess Club video channel. In this video, I'd like to illustrate how by playing the Queen's Gambit, it's possible to gain very dynamic opportunities within the opening and sometimes a quick win. So let's just dive into the position and see what we're talking about. So this is a starting position, and what we're talking about here is move 1d4. And the most common reply will be 1d5. Both players are trying to control these central squares highlighted in green. Now, sometimes white might play knight f3, or alternatively, they might play bishop f4. And there's nothing wrong with these moves, except for they tend to lead to quite slow developing positions with not an awful lot of opportunities for either side. If you're looking for more dynamic play, the main move would be c4, the Queen's Gambit. A gambit is where you give up a pawn or some other form of material in order to gain some compensation. That compensation could be better control of the center, more active piece development, or something of a similar nature. So let's have a look first of all at what happens when black takes the pawn. Well, I'll show you two lines here just to show you some of the ideas. It is possible for white to play e3, and this immediately attacks the pawn on c4 with a bishop on f1. Now you might say, okay, well, then the obvious thing is to stop that bishop from taking the pawn, and let us play move b5. This defends the pawn on c4. Now, white comes back and attacks the pawn that defends the pawn. Obviously, if black were now to take the pawn over here, the bishop would take the pawn on c4. Black is still a pawn up. The pawn on a4 will drop very quickly. And in the meantime, white has already got good development and better control of the center. So instead, they might play a6. a6 is a mistake because in this position, white can play a takes b5, and it's not possible for black to play a takes b5 back because white simply takes the rook off on a8, and that would be pretty much as close as you can get to a win. So let's assume that black has seen that and decides instead to move the c pawn to c6, defending the pawn on on b5. Now again, white takes the pawn on b5. The pawn is recaptured, and now you can just pause the video just for a second and think about what you'd like to play now, what the best move might be. When evaluating a position, one of the things you should always look for is our undefended pieces. Any piece that's not defended is called a loose piece. And Grandmaster John Nunn coined the phrase, loose pieces drop off. Now, just because your opponent has a loose piece doesn't mean to say that there's an immediate tactic, but you need to keep your eye on it because there may well be a tactic based on that loose piece somewhere down the line. Here, there is an immediate possibility. The only piece in black's position which is undefended is the rook on a8. The only way to attack it is to play queen f3. And what we see immediately is that the rook can't move. Furthermore, there's no way of defending the rook. And the only way to avoid the rook losing the rook would be to put the bishop in the way or the knight in the way. In either case, white would take the piece and be a piece up. So just a few moves in and black has already lost. You can't always rely on that. Now, there's nothing wrong with the move e3. It's been played at the very highest level and is a very standard move. Personally, because I don't believe in playing for traps, I would prefer to move e4. This immediately dominates the center. Now, the best move in this position actually is e5, which we'll have a look at later on in this video. But let's say they don't see the move e5, which looks like it just gives up a pawn, and they simply play the move e6. Now the bishop can take the pawn. The knight may come to f6 to attack the pawn on e4, and so the knight then goes to c3 to defend the pawn on e4. Black plays bishop b4, trying to be as active as possible, putting the pressure on the e4 square, which is now being threatened by the knight because the knight on c3 is defended. Well, now, in this position, one possibility is bishop d3. This looks like a mistake because by playing bishop d3, we cut off the queen's defense d4. However, if the queen was to take that pawn, remember John Nunn's saying, loose pieces drop off. The loose piece in this position is the black queen. And here it does drop off because white then plays bishop b4 check, leaving a discovered attack on the queen. The check has to be responded to, so let's say knight c6, and then simply queen takes d4, and white is a queen up. So again, we can't assume that black is going to fall for that. So the obvious thing to do is to castle, because now after queen takes d4, there is no discovered check, which uncovers the attack on d4 square. So white plays knight f3. It's a good central development. And now let's say, for example, black plays b6. Now we play d5. Knight is attacked. So the knight goes into d5, adding pressure onto the knight on c3. You may want to pause the position at this stage and think, what should white do? I mean, there are many moves. I mean, it could be that you move the bishop to d2. It could be possibly that you play the bishop to e4, pinning the knight against the rook. But the correct move is much more dramatic. The correct move is bishop takes h7. This is called the Greek gift. One thing to know about the Greek gift sacrifice is that it is dependent upon white having control of the g5 square. Here, the bishop and the knight can both go to g5, so it's fine. So the king takes. Now we go knight g5. Now, what are the possibilities? First of all, the queen could take the knight on g5, but the bishop would recapture and black would be a queen down. So we can rule that out. Black could move the king to h8, then after queen h5 check, king g8, queen h7, and that's curtains. So maybe they decide to go to g8. Well, again, we throw the queen in, attacking the h7 square threatening mate. The only way that black can really defend against the threat of mate on h7 is by playing rook e8. Then we take the pawn on f7, pushing the king into the corner. It can't go to h7. Then back to queen h5 check, king g8, the only move. And you might think, are we just repeating moves here? We are, after all, a piece down. So is that the best we can get? No. When attacking, try to get the queen closer to the king. You'll be surprised how often new ideas come up as you get closer. The queen goes down to h7. The king goes to f8, only move. Now the queen goes down to h8, check. The king has only one move, and that's e7, and then queen takes g7, checkmate, game over. So we've ruled out the 3 moves. There's only 2 left. In this position, black could go to h6. Then we simply take a pawn on e6, uncovering the attack from c1 to h6. The king has to move, and at very least, if not more, we can just win the queen. So assuming that black has worked out that there'll be a queen down if they put it on h6, they go to g7, g6. Well, now the critical move is one which you should know, you should learn when you play the Greek gift, h4. This threatens to push the pawn to h5, pushing the king out into the center where it will get mated. There's not anything that black can do here apart from give up his queen by sacrificing it over here. So, for example, if knight takes here on c3, attacking the queen and threatening a discovered check, or if it's taken a fork on the rook and the king, it really doesn't make any difference. It's irrelevant because in this position we play on h5, king f5, and queen f3 is checkmate. Simple. So that's the kind of idea that white is playing. But let's think if they had been learning their openings and they knew that e5 was the correct move. Now, what we don't want to do is take this pawn, because if we do, then the queens come off, the king it goes to d1, the knight attacks the pawn on e5, the knight defends it, the bishop comes out quickly, pinning the knight, again threatening e5. If white, for example, goes bishop e2, or if they go bishop f4, in either case, we simply castle queenside. The king moves, and then the knight comes here, and then from there it will go to g6, and from g6 it will take the pawn on e5, and a very good game for black. So as white, we don't want that happening. So instead, the knight goes to f3, the pawn takes on d4, and the bishop takes on c4. Now, it is true that black is a pawn up in this position, and it's a bit of a thorn in white's side being this pawn over here because it stops knight from going to c3 or the bishop going to e3. So one way of keeping that pawn solid there is to play c5. The trouble with c5 is black is way behind in development. And in this position, white can simply play knight e5. This threatens to attack the pawn on f7, and with it, the rook will drop off on h8. How can black respond? Well, moves like knight h6 are simply met with queen takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, and then knight f7, forking the queen and the rook. The only way to defend the f7 square is to play bishop e3, and then bishop takes e6, f takes e6, queen h5, pawn up to block the check, knight takes g6, pawn takes g6, queen takes h8, and white has won a rook for a knight and a much better position. Okay. So let's ask ourselves now, what happens if after c4, black simply decides to defend the pawn with a knight? Can't be wrong, surely. It's developing a piece to the center and it's defending the pawn on d5. Well, it is actually a mistake. It has been played at the highest level, but in general, it doesn't work out very well for black. If Black would take with the queen. White would simply gain more time by playing knight to c3, attacking the queen, and very quickly play e4 and dominate the center and push black back. So much more likely is that they will take the pawn with the knight. Now you can play e4. I would advise against it because there are some lines in which black gets quite a lot of play. They come back to f6, attacking the pawn on e4. We defend it with knight c3, and then they play e5. And in this position, black is beginning to get back into the game. We won't go through all the complexities of this, but it's okay for black. So instead, we decide there's no rush. Instead, we'll take control of the e5 square before we play e4. They then play e6. Now we play e4. Knight moves away. And then we just keep developing. The bishop comes out again. This bishop comes to d3. White castles. We play e5. Black plays c5. And you should know what to do in this position. Just look at it for a moment and decide what is white's best move. Well, lo and behold, it's bishop takes h7, king takes h7, knight g4 check, king g6, h4, pawn takes here, h5, king f4, queen h3, king e5. Oh, have we let the king out? Well, I'll give you a couple of seconds just to think about the position. Think about what your next move would be. You can pause the video if you need some more time. But the simple answer is you play queen f4, checkmate. So we've seen a few lines. They're by no means forced. If your opponent is a strong player, they won't fall for any of these things. But it gives you an idea of the kind of play that white is looking for. If you're interested in the kind of positions we saw in this video, then have a look a bit further and hopefully you might become an aficionado of the Queen's Gambit, declined or accepted. So until our next video, good chess, and I'll see you soon. Take care.